Welcome to Ecclesia Principles, a biblical strategy for believers to engage in God's design for government with Ray Eppard.
Hello, glad you could join us today. We're talking about Ecclesia Principles, and there's actually some things that I want to kind of go back to and develop a little bit further. The separation of powers, which is one of the key principles. We generally, in the United States, think of separation of powers as the different divisions of government. But that concept, the concept of separation of powers, doesn't come from the idea of different parts of government. It actually goes back to the jurisdictions that God has established. Now, the first time in the Bible that we see an example of the separation of powers is in Genesis chapter 2. And we'll read here Genesis 2, verses 23 and 24. Because in this is day 6 of creation, and God has put Adam to sleep. He's made Eve. He brings Eve to him. And then in verse 23, he says, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother." Now, let me just point out something here real quick. Adam didn't have a father or mother. If you would, he's speaking by the Spirit of God, and this is, if you would, the first prophetic utterance in Scripture as far as a person speaking by the Spirit of God. He says, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Now, in this, the first jurisdiction just that God made was that of self-government. Genesis 1:26, God said, "Let us make man in our image. Let them have dominion." That giving of dominion was the establishment of self-government. Adam, because Eve had not been made yet, Adam was given dominion over the entire earth, and he was the only person. So it was purely self-government. Now, later in that verse, it brings in the fact that Eve had been created, and it said they had dominion. So when it was Adam, it was just Adam. But when Eve came along, she also had dominion. If you would, even though they were a family at that point, and that is the second jurisdiction, is family government, the authority, the jurisdiction was divided. He had authority, she had authority. Now here, when he says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh," at this point he's saying is there is a family government, mother and father. They have kids, but eventually these kids are going to grow up and they're going to leave the jurisdiction of this family. They'll leave it, which means if they leave it, they're no longer under it. They're no longer a part of that jurisdiction. They have, if you would, their own jurisdiction. They have their own family. It becomes a separate jurisdiction. It becomes a separate family with its own family government. Now, obviously, there are those that try to keep their family under their government all their lives, but that's not the design of God. So if you would here, this is the first example of God separating powers. Adam and Eve, as individuals, had authority. Collectively, they had authority. But Adam, speaking by the Spirit of God, said, "A man shall leave his father and mother, cleave to his wife," and basically they become their own home, a separation of powers. Now with this, let's dive down a little bit further. The third jurisdiction that God established chronologically is that of civil government. Genesis 9:6. God gave to humanity the right to punish lawbreakers. God gave humanity the right to inflict punishment upon those who took away the rights of others. That's why our founding fathers came up with the phrase that was included in the Declaration of Independence when they talked about the unalienable rights. And then they said that for the preservation of these rights, governments are established among men. Historically, that's not a true statement. Historically, governments have been established for selfish purposes, which is why throughout history, most governments have been some form of a monarchy, some form of dictatorship, or some form of oligarchy where a small group of people rule over the masses, and again, primarily for their own benefit. The nation of America, the United States of America, we were established under the concept of the preservation of the rights. The only place that you find government being established prior to the United States of America, the only place that you find government being instituted for the preservation of rights is in Scripture. It's the only other place you find it. That's really all it's for. That's why God put it in there. So in that sense, again, going back to the idea of the separation of powers, God, even, like I said, family government, he separated them. If you would, in a manner of speaking, through healthy division, he divided the family unit and created another one with another, eventually, father and mother. And then it would continue to multiply thereafter. Each jurisdiction, and the fourth jurisdiction that God established is that of the church, the ecclesia. Jesus said, all power has been given unto me in heaven and earth, therefore you go. Matthew 28. God gave authority to Christ as the Lord and head of the church. The church is to function independently of these other things. It is its own jurisdiction. It is the fourth one that God established. These four jurisdictions are to be separated. If you would, family government is not to override self-government. Family government is not to override civil government. Civil government is not to override self-government. Civil government is not to override church government. Church government is not to override civil government. There is to be a separation of powers. Now, one of the reasons I want to take some more time with this, because as we're going deeper into the concept of what I call ecclesia principles, we're entering a phase now of getting into topics that are really more of a balancing act. They have to stay in balance. When it comes to the separation of powers, self-government needs to stay intact. Family government needs to stay intact. Civil government needs to stay intact. Church government needs to stay intact. But you have all four of these functioning at the same time within a society. Now the problem is every so often, one of them wants to rise up. And if you would, when self-government rises up, as we've talked about, and everyone is their self-government. The greatest example of self-government overreaching into family government, church government, and civil government is a mob. It's a riot, where every person does what they want to do regardless of what family it affects, regardless of what business it affects, regardless of what governmental laws are, regardless of what crimes are considered, the mob functions at will. It has extended its jurisdiction into places that it does not belong. And anytime a jurisdiction moves out of its proper place, out of that balance, it always produces destruction. It may not do it instantaneously. It may not do it in the first week. It may not do it in the first couple years. Now, the tendency of self-government, however, usually if that gets out of whack, if it gets out of that balance and begins to take a much more dominant position than any of the other jurisdictions, it usually produces destruction immediately. The Founding Fathers referred to it this way: the tyranny of the majority. This is why the founders did not want the United States to be a democracy. And if you read the statements of the Founding Fathers, we are not a democracy. And in all honesty, if you ever hear anybody call our nation a democracy, one of two things is happening. One, either they're unaware of what our governmental structure really is, and I'm saying that knowing that there are congressmen and senators and presidents who have said that, and they're really unaware of what our governmental structure is. We are a republic. Benjamin Franklin, when asked, "What form of government have you given us?" It was a lady asking him, he said, "Ma'am, a republic if you can keep it." You see, a republic is a representative form of government. Now, if you would break it down, we are a democratic republic. Our representatives are chosen through democracy. That aspect of choosing the representatives is based on the concepts of democracy, that the people, the citizens, are to have the vote, and then they select their representatives. Then their representatives go and determine the laws and so forth. In that, the founders were so opposed to democracy, to a pure democracy, because history shows that pure democracies fail very quickly. Because at that point, the majority begin to vote in what they want, what they like, rather than what is good for the society, rather than being governed by law, the rule of law. They are governed by their own impulses. And we are far too close to that scenario in our current situation. The majority of people, you hear people frequently say, "Oh, well, majority rules, majority rules." That's not the way America was set up. And it wasn't set up that way expressly so that self-government would stay in balance, that it wouldn't get out of bounds, that it would stay in its proper place. Its self-government should be always honored and recognized, but not to where it overthrows the family, civil government, or the church. Well, we will continue this again tomorrow. God bless you. Have a great day.